Sensible Drug Policy at CU. We are very excited about this event and what it means for the future of 420 on campus. And so I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit before we bring up Neill Franklin about why SSDP is here, who SSDP is, and kind of why we decided to do this event. So Students for Sensible Drug Policy is actually an international organization with chapters across the US, in the UK, in Ireland. There are chapters internationally. So we're a wide range of students who have majors in a variety of disciplines. And basically we were brought together by the belief that the drug war has been a failure and that there are better solutions to the problem of substance use and abuse. So Students for Sensible Drug Policy here at CU Boulder has been an active chapter for about 6 years now. We've been a little bit quieter over the last few years, so we're really trying to revamp our energy this year. We were founded by an alumni named Cameron, who was here today, so our network is very strong even after we graduate. Some of you guys are students in the room, and I highly recommend you get involved with Students for Sensible Drug Policy because it's a good platform to start your career. Whether you're interested in drug politics, if you're interested in the cannabis industry, if you're interested in international drug policy reform, international studies, Students for Sensible Drug Policy creates a fantastic foundation for you to study a wide range of things in this realm. So I thought I'd just tell you guys a little bit about how SSDP has benefited me and some of the people that I know, just to kind of give you guys an idea of why we do this. So SSDP empowers students to be involved in the political process. As an undergrad, I have been very shy when it comes to being involved in voting encouragement or talking to my peers about politics, anything like that. And I actually lobbied the federal government with Students for Sensible Drug Policy last year. So we went to Washington, D.C., and with almost 100 students, we lobbied the federal government. And we essentially asked for smarter sentencing for crack cocaine rules. We asked for respect for state marijuana laws and a couple other initiatives we were talking about with the federal government. So SSDP teaches you how to be involved in the political process. It teaches you in a way that's friendly. We have guides who are they're coaching you along the way. You're never left alone in SSDP. So a lot of times in this industry and in drug policy reform, we talk about the stigma that we face. Anytime you talk about substance use or people who use substances, you might get a strange look, a strange face from folks. And SSDP has provided a community that just enables you to feel like you're normal. You meet like-minded people who are also believe that the war on drugs has been a failure and there are better solutions. So one of the ways SSDP thinks there's a better solution is to treat drug use as a public health issue instead of a criminal one. So SSDP isn't necessarily a free-for-all ideology. We think that we don't condone or condemn drug use, but rather we think we should minimize the impact of drug use on society and on the individuals who choose to consume drugs. We see that prohibition hasn't worked, that people are still consuming drugs despite their illegal status. And so we think that there are other ways to approach this. SSDP has also taught me how to be a leader. I was a very shy freshman. I got involved with Students for Sensible Drug Policy my freshman year at a community college here in Colorado. And since then, I've worked my way up and now lead the chapter here at CU. It's a building process. SSDP, like I said, guides you the whole way. It's taught me how to work with others, how to just develop relationships with others, how to reach out to others for what you need. So SSDP has cultivated a huge skill set in me that's enabled me to get a great job within 3 months after college. So finally, I'll just mention that the SSDP Alumni Association is in development right now. And the goal with that is to mentor students and to create a community that extends beyond the undergraduate world and even the graduate and law school world. So some of you were in the career exploration panel before and you met some SSDP alumni from around the country. SSDP supports people throughout their careers if they choose to stay in drug policy reform or not. So I just wanted to tell you guys a little bit about SSDP and what it's done for us. I would just like to ask the SSDP at CU members to stand up and thank them for coming and helping us put on this event.
Yeah.
So this is just two of the members that we have at our chapter. Our chapter is about 7 to 10 members strong, who come almost every other week and really participated in putting this event together. You know, the people you've seen buzzing around all day are going to be the future leaders of the cannabis industry, the drug policy reform industry, of psychedelic therapy, of the future. So I strongly recommend you just look around and get to know these people, because I guarantee you have a lot in common with them. Without further ado, I'd like to bring up, well, first, does anybody have any questions about SSDP? Students for Sensible Drug Policy, what we do, how you can get involved? Yeah. Not necessarily. Our chapter is required to have a portion of students involved. It has to be the majority. So we strive to maintain a strong student membership, but it doesn't prohibit you if you're not a student. You can absolutely attend. Just asking for everybody. Yeah, we have, at CU, we have bi-weekly meetings. They're every other week. Typically, that's what we've done in this semester. We have a new leadership coming in, and so I imagine they're going to have some meetings coming up in the fall. So please get involved if you guys are interested. Without further ado, I'll bring up Carol to introduce Neill. Dr. Carol Konzelman. Dr. Carol Konzelman is the faculty advisor for Students for Sensible Drug Policy at CU. Dr. Konzelman has been absolutely instrumental in the growth of our chapter here. She has provided aid in ways that I didn't even know we could need. The bureaucracy of a university is a big bureaucracy. It's tough to go through the loopholes, the things that they ask you to do for student funding. For funding for events like this are really hard to navigate, and her support has just enabled us to create this event and create a chapter that will succeed beyond the students who are currently involved. So, Carol.
Thank you. And let's give a huge round of applause to Carol. Okay, Kara Janowski is a force of nature. She has been unbelievable, pulling so many strings together for this event, and I just couldn't ask for a better person to work with, Kara, than you to pull this off. So it's been so fun, and thank you for all of you for being here. So before I forget, before I introduce our final speaker, we have a little gift for our featured speakers today. And because Neill will be flying back to Baltimore, this is like our thank you note. It's a book it's an illustrated children's book by Ricardo Cortez called It's Just a Plant, a children's story about marijuana. And this is what we are giving as a gift to our speakers. So I'm going to pass it around if you would write just a little note in the front, a couple little blank pages. Then Neill can take it home with him. So before introducing Neill formally, I would like to give a huge shout out to our sponsors today. So the Student Group Funding Board, Vicente Sederberg Law Firm, The Growing Kitchen, TC Labs, Walking Raven LLC, Kloppenberg Smith Consulting Group, Ozo Coffee, Big Daddy Bagels, Cosmos Pizza, the Global Studies Residential Academic Program, and the Sustainability and Social Innovation Residential Academic Program. Let's give a round of applause for our sponsors. Now, as we move through the rest of this event and into 420 itself on Monday, this coming Monday, I want you to remember our hashtags. Again, appropriately named. I mean, we couldn't have invented a better thing. So our hashtags are Cannabis Symposium 2015 and Transform 420 spelled out AT, at CU. And eventually, it's our hope that this event today will serve as a model to other universities around the country so that next year when we hold this Cannabis Symposium on April 20th, in the UMC ballroom, there will be other campuses around the country at the same time holding teach-ins on cannabis and drug policy reform. And so in the future, I would love to see Transform 420 at MSU or U of M or DU or any other university that's around. So our main objective for this symposium is to set a new standard of for drug and policy education on our campus and around the country. Since the state of Colorado is in the vanguard of cannabis policy reform, we believe that CU Boulder, as Colorado's flagship university, should be in the vanguard of drug and drug policy education here and around the country. When we were thinking about who would be the ideal person to deliver the inaugural closing plenary address for the 2015 Cannabis Symposium, Major Neill Franklin was the most obvious choice. As a retired state police major and detective from Baltimore, Maryland, and the current executive director of Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, or LEAP, Neill Franklin brings a level of credibility and legitimacy that is unparalleled in the field of drug policy reform today. He spent his distinguished career enforcing our nation's drug prohibition laws and witnessing firsthand the destructive social impacts of the U.S. war on drugs, including mass incarceration, institutionalized racism, the militarization of our police forces, discrimination from felony convictions, and the violence produced by an unregulated black market for drugs that remain in high demand. He also was personally affected by the number of undercover and I guess not undercover police officers that were caught in the crossfire of this violence as well in intending to enforce the law of the land. So Major Neill Franklin is a 34-year law enforcement veteran of the Maryland State Police and Baltimore Police Departments. During his time on the force, he held the position of commander for the Education and Training Division and the Bureau of Drug and Criminal Enforcement. Early in his career, Neill served as a narcotics agent with the Maryland State Police, focusing on everything from high-level drug dealers in the Washington suburbs to the guy growing one marijuana plant on his balcony. Neill was proud of his work and the hundreds of arrests he executed. I had been taught that people who use and sell drugs are trash, he says, and that we need to put those people behind bars forever. His talk today is going to explain why his point of view changed, and we are so glad that Neill accepted our invitation to help us link the issues we've been discussing all day today related to cannabis use, legalization, and regulation in Colorado to the broader crisis of the failed U.S. war on drugs in the national and international context. This talk is being live streamed around the country and will be available in the future as a YouTube link if you would like to have access to it. So please join me in welcoming Major Neill Franklin.
So, can you hear me okay? It's on. You have to be very careful with these lapel mics and not go to the restroom while you have them on. Had problems with that before. Anyway, thank you. Thanks for having me this evening. And I want to thank Carol. This is a very busy woman. And I've got to see that firsthand. She gave me a tour of the campus yesterday, and she's just everywhere and doing a lot of work. And so what do you think about this day, this symposium that she and SSDP and others are responsible for putting on? Great day. Absolutely. You know, I've been doing this work now, officially speaking for LEAP, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, since 2008. And I continue to learn, even today, and sitting in on some of the panels, I'm still learning. And as said, I used to be someone who was completely on the opposite side of this. One thing I'll say about this movement, about this work that we are doing, and I've met thousands of people involved in this work. I've yet to meet anyone who has started this journey of reform, who is learning, who has started this journey and started moving down this road of reform, and then decided to turn around and go back. Once you begin this journey, you don't go back because it's truth. You may stall along the way, but you never go back to prohibition. And I think that's something that's very important, something that's very important to note, and something that's very poignant. It says something about this movement that we're in and this fight that we're in to change things. So we have a lot to talk about. We have a lot to talk about, and so be patient with me. I want to talk about a little bit about the history of all of this. You know, I want to talk a little bit more about LEAP and my involvement with LEAP, and I want to talk not just about cannabis, and I know this is a Cannabis Symposium, but it's not just about cannabis. You know, the thousands of people, tens of thousands of people who are in prison for issues of addiction, a lot of that's not about cannabis, folks. And we can't forget those people. We can't forget the people who are being arrested right now. As we sit here, as we have been here all day, the people who are currently being arrested for heroin addiction, for meth, for cocaine. We have to do something about that too. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. We're going to talk about the many problems of this issue of prohibition. And hopefully at the end, during Q&A, we can figure out how we continue to help move this issue forward and resolve some of the things that we're dealing with. So, why don't we go all the way back, say about 100 years? And many of you probably already know the history, but there's still so many people who don't, especially since this is being recorded and live streamed. We have to paint the best possible picture that we can for the totality of this issue. Not just one piece. We'll try to cover as much as we can and give a really good picture for the totality of it. So let's go all the way back to, say, like 1914 and the significance of that year in the Harrison Narcotics Act. Because when we talk about all these drugs that are illegal, they used to be legal. So again, and I've heard people talk about the relegalization of cannabis. Okay, we're going to be talking about the relegalization, ending the prohibition of other drugs as well, like heroin. All right, don't be frightened now. It's not that bad. But this all began 100 years ago. And beginning with the 1914 Harrison Narcotics Act and coming forward, there were some key things. Drug control in this country really wasn't so much about drug control. It's about social control. It's about controlling groups of people. It's about economics. And some of the key people, a couple of the key people back then, as we start to come forward, there's a gentleman by the name of Randolph Hearst. Then we have DuPont, we have Harry Anslinger. But let's start with Hearst, the newspaper guy. And I think he had about maybe 28 newspapers, major newspapers that he owned in the country. So back then, newspapers were the internet of today. You know, you just didn't pick up the telephone and call people. You didn't send a text. For all you young people that are listening, you just didn't send a text. You know, Facebook wasn't around, Twitter wasn't around, and all the handles and all that stuff, okay? Newspapers were key. Now, why was this important to him? Because obviously newspapers involve paper, okay, which hemp made very good paper, still does today. But Hearst was invested in lumber. And a lot of our paper, obviously made today, comes from lumber, pulp, wood pulp. So economically, this was a good thing for him. As well as DuPont, you know, dealing with the chemicals that were used for printing, and as you come forward in time, eventually synthetics and nylon and rope and all those other things. So let's, you know, and these are the wonderful, some of the wonderful members of LEAP and what we look like. But we'll talk about them a little later. Newspapers. So some of the messages that were being communicated to people, like this one, the evil Mexican plant. It drives you insane. And it was mentioned earlier today in one of the panels about the term marijuana. The derogatory term marijuana. That's why we like to use the term cannabis. Cannabis. What else about these newspapers? You know, here's some more. And this was, you know, this is what was being communicated to people. Beware, young and old, people in all walks of life. Warning, you know, these very powerful words about dope peddlers and how shrewd they are. You know, and how they might slip some of this in your tea, drive you to murder and insanity and death. People believe this stuff. There wasn't much to counteract. There wasn't any messaging to counteract this or speak against it. And, you know, piece after piece after piece, the devil's harvest. There's that term marijuana again. You know, tying it to Mexicans again. Reefer Madness in that wonderful movie. Reefer Madness. So this is what we were dealing with back then. And the brainwashing that was going on. And again, the incentives behind all this weren't really honest. And this man, Harry J. Anslinger, listen to some of the things that he was saying. Now, this guy was the first commissioner of the U.S. Treasury Department's Bureau of Narcotics. He was controlling the show, had a lot of power. And as we move forward in time, we end up with the DEA, but that's another story. So here he talks about, you know, 100,000 total marijuana smokers in the U.S. He's talking about them being Negroes and Hispanics and Filipinos and entertainers, you know, that devil's music, jazz music, and so on. Satanic music. The primary reason to outlaw marijuana is its effect on the degenerate races. Social control, controlling populations of people. Talks about how addictive it is and leads to criminality and death and insanity again and on and on and on. You smoke a joint and you're likely to kill your brother. You know, you even still hear some of that from people today. Every time something happens, the first thing they look at, oh, how can we tie this to marijuana use? So this is what we're dealing with, and the information that is being made available to people as we're trying to deal with this propaganda that's out there. Even to the point, now this is interesting. So we're going through all of this, and now we have World War II. And now we're building all these ships, and we have no rope. So what do? We kind of shift gears here for a while. Hemp for victory. Now we're trying to get farmers to grow hemp again so that we can supply our ships with rope. And it's this, you know, and this is economics again. This is economics again. Now, moving forward a little quickly here, we end up with Richard Nixon in the 1970s and his political posturing, and he launches the Schaefer Commission to examine cannabis in this country and whether or not we should criminalize it this huge commission to study it and to give a recommendation. I mean, that's what we do in government. That's what we do. This was his commission, 1972. And they pretty much advised the president this: the actual and potential harm of use of the drug is not great enough to justify intrusion by the criminal law into private behavior, a step which our society takes only with the greatest reluctance. So they were basically saying, no, 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 let's not criminalize this. He buries it. He doesn't even take the advice of his own commission because he has another agenda. He's dealing with the Vietnam War and the protests. And who's protesting the Vietnam War? Marijuana smokers, the flower children, the hippies. And it's a way for him to control them. He also had his Southern strategy. Has anyone read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, by anyone? About mass incarceration. And she speaks to this. She speaks to Richard Nixon's Southern strategy of, again, controlling the Negro population. So again, social control. Now politics is in on the game. And we continue to head down this road of prohibition. One of the interesting things about prohibition is that we're just repeating history. Alcohol prohibition from the 1920s, which ended in 1933 with the repeal of the 18th Amendment. So when you look at alcohol prohibition and you look at prohibition of today, you see some similarities. Let's start with what got me focused on this, and I'll talk a little bit about that later. Violent crime. If you look at homicides in this country on a scale, bless you, if you look at homicides, there are 2 times in our nation's history when the homicide rate was extremely high. Number one was alcohol prohibition, on that roughly 13-year period. After 1933, the end of alcohol prohibition, the homicide rate in this country went back down to levels before, very low. But then when we started the war, the so-called war on drugs, it shot right back up again. Now, we've had a little bit of a reduction. The reduction we are seeing in homicides today is nowhere near where it was between alcohol prohibition and today's drug prohibition. We still have a long way to go to get back down to that level. And it can be done if we end prohibition. So that's what we were dealing with as we come forward. Now we're in the midst of the war on drugs and all of its harm. This is the policy of prohibition. This isn't about drugs. The harms that we're seeing and we're going to talk about, it's not about drugs. It's about the policy. The policy that we have chosen to manage drugs, and that's prohibition. I spoke about violent crime. That's what got me focused on this. Corporal Edward Totley. Corporal Edward Totley was a very good friend of mine. The picture you see up here right now is when I retired from the Maryland State Police. This is my retirement celebration, and that's Corporal Totley in the picture with me. Corporal Totley was an undercover narcotics agent for the Maryland State Police. He had done that work for a very long time, well over a decade, and he was very good at what he was doing. I also worked undercover during my career, so I knew exactly what he was going through. Just a few months after this, and I was working for the Baltimore Police Department at this time as the head of training, Ed was working in Washington, D.C. with the FBI. He was working on a Safe Streets campaign, and he was buying cocaine from a mid-level drug dealer. In this business of drug dealing, where it's unregulated, where it's literally every person for themselves, as you try to corner your market share, when you decide to rip someone off, you see, because we rip people off in the legal business too. We do. We don't always play fair, but when you do it in an illicit market, this is what happens. When this guy that Ed was buying cocaine from, this was going to be the last buy. So the guy decided that he wanted to rip Ed totally off. This time, he was going to keep the money and the drugs. So Ed was waiting for him in the car, for him to come back from getting the drugs. And when he got back to the car, he just shot Ed totally at point-blank range in the side of his head. No words exchanged, no nothing, just flat out shot him. You see, because if you rip off a drug dealer, most likely they're going to retaliate. They're going to come back at you. That's the nature of the business. I don't know if any of you have seen the HBO series The Wire. This type of illicit atmosphere surrounding drug dealing is portrayed in that series. And that's what happened to Ed. Now, this was a father, he was a son, he was a husband, and he was a good friend. Throughout my career with the Maryland State Police of criminal investigation and working undercover and commanding drug task forces, every once in a while I would get a little glimpse of the problems of drug prohibition. But it wasn't enough to make me pause long enough to focus on it and to analyze it and to make a decision as to whether or not it was working or not. But when this happened, I did. And I paused long enough to realize that, wow, when I was working undercover, there was a detective in Baltimore City who I knew, Marcellus Ward, who was killed in a very similar circumstance. I then thought about two Baltimore City police officers, because I was working with the Baltimore Police Department at this time. Soon after Ed was killed, we had two Baltimore City police officers. One was gunned down by a drug dealer on a street corner. Another had his police cruiser rammed while he was fleeing the police. Drug dealer was fleeing the police because he had just shot one of his rivals. And it didn't stop there, because I realized something, that it wasn't just about the police. What about the innocent? Not that police aren't innocent. That's another story. Have you ever seen these memorials throughout some of our major cities, the balloons and the teddy bears on poles and at different places where people have been killed? No city is safe from the violence that comes from the drug trade. And the drug trade is the foundation of much of the violence that we have in our communities. 2 years after Ed was killed, while I'm still going through this process of research and just searching for answers, this happened. In this corner row home where a family lived, it was the Dawson family. It was a family of 7, mother, father, and 5 kids. And on that corner, a drug dealer and his crew had set up shop. Open-air drug markets. That's what they do. That's what the business is about. She was working with the police, as we want citizens to do, to get him and his crew arrested and in jail. He found out about it, and so he decided he was going to send a message. You don't work with the police to get me arrested. You're messing with my money. You're messing with my business. So he set their home on fire one night and killed the entire family. So whether it's this scenario, or a drive-by shooting, or a running gun battle, where people get caught in a crossfire, and a lot of them are kids, it wouldn't exist if we didn't have the policies that we had to manage drugs. It's just that simple. We didn't learn from the 1920s. And personally, I think a lot of it has to do with where the violence is occurring. Because if the violence was occurring in gated America, in suburban America, it would have ended as quickly as alcohol prohibition did. Alcohol prohibition lasted only 13 years. It's been 5 decades. So, what about the ones, so I've talked about the police, I've talked about the Dawson family, I've talked about kids getting caught in the crossfire, but what about the ones in the game? What about the ones that are on the street corners selling the drugs? What about the ones who, and there are many reasons why they end up in these positions of selling drugs in this illicit market. Yes, some of them choose to do that. But when you grow up in a community where, as a child, this is what you see and experience, where jobs aren't that plentiful, and more than likely, and of course, enforcement is extremely high, sooner or later, you're probably going to catch a charge doing something, get arrested. Once you get arrested, then you're dealing with, okay, so now how do I get a job? So what about the ones in the game? For whatever reason they're in the game. At the end of the day, it's a life. It's someone's son, it's someone's daughter, it's someone's father, it's someone's uncle, nephew. This is Central America. So we have a lot of violence in our communities. We don't talk enough about Mexico and the northern states of Mexico. We don't talk enough about Honduras. The tens of thousands of people who are murdered at the hands of the cartels. That has a lot to do with our immigration problem, as we call it, but extreme violence. And there's no end in sight as long as we have these policies of prohibition. No end in sight. It's about trafficking routes in Central America. Trafficking routes for the drugs that we like to use. Come in here. We have a responsibility. All right, let's move forward. Let's talk about disease. Another problem of these policies, again, of prohibition. Disease. HIV, hepatitis C, still a big problem that we have with intravenous drug users. But let's talk about Portugal. Let's talk about some of the things that can happen when we change our policies. If you're not familiar, 12 years ago, roughly, in Portugal, they decriminalized personal use of all drugs. 10-day supply, it's not a criminal offense. At most, they will refer you to a panel to evaluate you to see if you have an addiction. What has happened? For HIV infections reported by drug users, they've had a 71% decrease in intravenous drug users, new cases of HIV, 71% decrease. We've done some things here in the United States regarding needle exchange programs. My city, Baltimore, was one of the first cities to move in this direction. And because they've supplied, through this program, clean syringes to those who are addicted to heroin, have had similar results. But there are some cities in this country that won't do it. That won't do it. This is about life. This is about saving lives. What about addiction? Sometimes I ask the question, sometimes the best answer is a question. And when I'm talking to someone for the first time about changing these policies, about reform, and we get into this conversation, sometimes I just go right to questions. Saying, okay, so what is drug prohibition about? What are our goals? What are we trying to do? I hope we have some goals for the policies that we've chosen. So is it reducing crime? Is it reducing addiction? Is it, what is it? And it's surprisingly, a lot of people can't even answer that because they don't know. So I help them. And I say, okay, what about this? What about that? What about addiction? What about death? What about overdose deaths? How about decreasing that and so on? So addiction is usually one of them. So if you go back and look over the past few decades, how have we been doing with addiction rates in this country? I don't think we've been all that successful. When we started down this road going back to 1914, 1.3% were addicted. When drugs were when drugs were legal, because remember I said go back more than 100 years, all this stuff was legal. Now we traveled down the road of making it illegal since 1914, and still we're looking at the same percentage roughly. It fluctuates here and there, but roughly, on average, 1.3% of the population. Addiction is much more than drugs. And I think we need to do more studies regarding addiction and the mind and the things that influence addiction. Because it's not just about drugs. It could be about gambling. It could be about sex. It could be about, talk to my wife, it could be about shopping. It could be about many things. So we have to deal with that. I want to read you something here real quick while we're talking about this thing of addiction. Are any of you familiar with the book High Price by Carl Hart? Write that down. High Price, Carl Hart. Carl Hart is a Columbia University professor. He was born and raised in southern Florida. He's a black gentleman. He has dreadlocks. He grew up in this drug-using environment. And he's now a professor doing clinical studies regarding drug use. These illicit drugs, cocaine, meth, and so on. And if there's anybody who would, and sometimes you wonder about the people who are doing certain studies, if they have a hidden agenda, if they want to move in a particular direction. But here's someone who, if anything, if he had an agenda, it would have been to say, yeah, we've really got to get rid of these drugs, they're a problem, and so on. But he talks about I'll try to read this quickly, and this is a part of his book, and it talks a little bit about some of the studies that he's doing at Columbia University up in New York, and he's been doing this for quite a long time. It says, the straight glass pipe filled with white smoke. It was thick enough to see that it could be a good hit. But it still had the wispy quality that distinguishes crack cocaine smoke from a cigarette or marijuana smoke. Here's the difference in the smoke. The smoker was 39, a black man who worked as a street bookseller. He closed his eyes and lay back in the battered leather office chair, holding his breath to keep the drug in his lungs as long as possible. Eventually, he exhaled. A serene smile on his face, his eyes closed to savor the bliss. About 15 minutes later, the computer signaled that another hit was available. No thanks, Doc, he said, raising his left hand slightly. He hit the space bar on the Mac in a way that he'd been trained to press to signal his choice. Although I couldn't know for sure whether he was getting cocaine or placebo, I knew that the experiment was going well. Here was a middle-aged brother, someone most people would label a crackhead, a guy who smoked rock at least 4 to 5 times a week, just saying no to a legal hit of what had a good chance to be of being 100% pure pharmaceutical grade cocaine. In the movie version, he would have been demanding more within seconds of his first hit, bug-eyed and threatening, or pleading and desperate. It goes on, he goes on to talk about, just how calm it was, how this guy just made a decision not to, for $5. See, when he would decide not to take a hit, he'd get $5. And so it goes on and on pretty much to say that as he was starting these clinical trials, it was clear that when other incentives are available, people make different decisions. And it's, we have to be very careful about what we watch, folks. The movies we watch, the news reports we watch, what we read, because you will get a perception in your mind about something and it be completely false. You've got to do your own research. That's what I've learned as I started my journey, to stop taking what people tell me and what I see on the news for granted. Do your own research, and corroborate that research, and develop your own opinions. And read this book, because as he goes further in his book, the case that what I see in the case that he makes is that if these drugs were not existing in an environment of prohibition, where you have people whose number one goal is to sell as much as they can, as quickly as they can, to make as much money as they can. They don't care really about how it's developed, how it's made, lace it with fentanyl. If it's made in a different process, under regulated control, quality control measures, you're going to see a completely different product. Now, don't get me wrong. Nothing that I say here, I'm not advocating for use of anything. Personally, I advocate for abstinence, except for Starbucks coffee, okay, and the wonderful caffeine that's in it. But what I'm saying is that the policies of prohibition make the drugs that we see out here far more problematic and dangerous than what they really need to be. You see, this drug use has always been here. It's here today. It's going to be here tomorrow. The question is, how do we manage it? How do we best manage it to mitigate the harms? Right now, we're not doing a very good job at it. Does education work? Of course education works. 1985 in the United States, 42% of people smoke tobacco products. Now, we all know how many people this kills. Hundreds of thousands. But what has happened over the past few decades? By 2003, that number had declined to 21%. Are we having shootouts in our streets? Are we sending people to prison? No. We're educating people. Okay, we're regulating it a little different. Socially unacceptable. I think that's probably the greatest influence in change. Okay? People who smoke tobacco products today, many of them feel like they're not third-class citizens, but fourth-class citizens, and just, ostracized from society. What about overdose deaths? We have a big problem in this country with overdose deaths. 1979, for 100,000 heroin users, 28 deaths is what we were experiencing. By 2000, up to 141 again, under the policies of prohibition. That is not success. It's not a good picture. And today, over the past 2 years, it's doubled. Yeah, we've got some issues of, people who are on pharmaceuticals for pain or whatever, doctors cut them off, cold turkey, now they start using heroin. And once you start using heroin in an illicit market where you have no idea what the potency of your dose is, when you have no idea what it may be laced with, it's a crapshoot. Lenny, you were talking about this earlier. And that's why we have so many overdose deaths. But again, Portugal. What has happened since they've taken a health-centered approach and decriminalized and get people the treatment and help that they need. Also in Portugal, what they've done, there's no DARE program in their schools, folks. They do have drug education, but twice a year, a healthcare practitioner comes in and teaches kids the truth about drugs. No fear tactics, the truth about drugs. And they've had a 52% decrease. We're going up. Their deaths are going down. That's progress. Corruption. Integrity, responsibility, courage, trust, that's what we want to see in our police officers. But we have police officers that don't want to take it. Once or twice a week or every couple of weeks, I tweet out a message about corrupt cop stories. From police chiefs to those working the streets getting caught. Corruption. And corruption is also about lying on the stand. It's also about planting drugs on people. This group here from New York, who were planting drugs on people they were arresting. This was a narcotics squad, right? And there was one member of the squad who was low on arrest, and he was about to be booted out of the squad. So what did his comrades do? They plant drugs on someone and give him the arrest. And they got caught. But we have a lot of this going on. And again, if we didn't have policies of prohibition, we'd be able to trust our police a whole lot more. What about misguided police? Since we've been doing this work, we haven't really been focused on violent crime the way that we should. Okay, when we first started in the late 1960s, before the drug war, we were solving 9 out of 10 murders in this country on national average. Now today, we only solve 6 out of 10. And being in that business, I can testify to the fact now that we're not focused on violent crime the way we should be. Everything's about drugs. It's about drugs. In most of our major cities, it could be 70% of our work is centered around drug enforcement. Not domestic violence, not crimes against our children, and so on. So what happens? So unsolved are 40% of our murders. Unsolved are 60% of our rapes and arsons. In this day and age of technology, DNA, better equipment, we're supposed to be smarter as an industry of policing. 75% of robberies go unsolved and 83% of property crimes. It's a big problem. What about broken police relations and problems with our constitutional rights? The militarization of our police. We've seen the First Amendment issues we've had in Ferguson. We didn't start militarizing our police departments like this until we got involved in the drug war. It wasn't the recent federal 1033 program where we got all this. We were getting equipment way back when we started putting together our SWAT teams to serve search warrants for drug investigations. That's when we started down this road of militarization. The drug war is the foundation for it, not the war on terror. I mean, the uniforms, and we've gotten to a point now in some of our cities, these uniforms are like the uniform of the day. No longer the creased slacks and, a white shirt. For the most part, anytime you can see somebody in jump boots with blouse pants and flak vest on the outside. I remember when we used to wear the ballistic vest on the inside. Not today. How'd that get in there? So what it says, in case you can't see it, do you think police are over-militarized? Well, that's a crossing guard. There's a little stop sign up there. Civil asset forfeiture, another big problem. This picture here is from Baltimore Police Department where I used to work. So we've gotten into the business now of taking cash away from people. Fourth Amendment issue, Fifth Amendment issue. Government takes property from someone, they should have due process. It's not happening the way it's supposed to happen. Literally, highway robbery is what we're experiencing today. Do not travel with large sums of cash. That's my advice to you. Make sure you know your rights. and how to defend those rights and how to opt out of a search. That's what it's about, folks. Incentivized policing. And that's one of the reasons, one of the many reasons why law enforcement is virtually the only opposition to us making this reform. Incentivized policing. Civil asset forfeiture. Federal funds being made available that we've now become dependent upon. Making the arrests so that we can get promoted, get good evaluations, get the good assignment, the cushy assignment, make detective. Incentivize policing. Another problem is the relationships that we currently don't have between police and community. The broken relationships, the broken bridges, because, like I said before, 70% of what we want to do, it seems like every time we have a field interview or interaction with a citizen, every time we stop a car on the highway, usually the first thing that we're thinking about is how can we search this car and the people in it. There's usually just two things we're thinking about. Yes, number one, safety, as we're approaching the car or whatever, but then we get to a point, priority number two, how can I get in the trunk? How can I get in the glove box? What questions do I ask? In the lower right-hand corner, in cities like Baltimore, if you drive through the streets long enough, you'll actually see strip searches right in the middle of the street. Right in the middle of the street. Now, with this being a daily activity in many of our communities, along with what I explained to you earlier about the Dawson family, the murder of the Dawson family, on one hand you have fear of retaliation in working with the police and giving information to the police. On the other hand, you just don't like the police. You don't trust the police. Because every time they search someone like this, they're searching a son, they're searching a nephew again, they're searching a father. And they talk about it, they witness it every day. There's not a lot of love for the police, and there's definitely not a lot of desire to talk to them or give them information about anything. And you can never, ever be effective in solving violent crime like your murders and your rapes without getting information from the community. It'll never happen. Cavity searches on the side of the highway. If you haven't seen this video, look it up on YouTube. It's disgusting. And this is what police officers are doing. Well-funded criminals is another problem. Come on. How can we agree to have the same policies for managing drugs that the cartels cherish? That the neighborhood crews and gangs desire to have? It doesn't make sense. The amount of drugs continues to increase, the tonnage continues to increase, the cash continues to build. That's a mere $255 million right there. That's all that is. That's just $255 million. Globally, this is a $322 billion industry. And that would cover a room 1,288 times that size every year. That's how much money is being made. It's a cash business. That's why it's such a violent business and competitive business. Why would we want to continue this? Because with this money, they buy guns and ammunition, and they use them. Our suffering economy, but thank goodness to the changes we're making in our cannabis policies, we're going to find some relief. I know your state has found some relief. In 1970, we were spending about $100 million in cops, courtrooms, and prisons. By 2010, it was over $50 billion. We had given birth, for instance, to the DEA, a $2.6 billion a year organization. By now, we're about $1.5 trillion. And we have so much need for this wasted money that continues to go down a rat hole. What about, now this is of concern to everybody, the availability of drugs to our kids. So let's talk about what Prohibition does regarding that availability. How's the current policy working for us? See, that should be one of the goals of our drug policies. And I don't think it's working so well. Do we have less drugs available to our children? What do you think? Well, not only do we not have less drugs available to our children, we have more, and they're more potent than ever before. But anyway, so to show that, DEA briefing book from 2001, so that you can see what has progressed throughout the years of Prohibition. So for the sake of this, let's go all the way back to the beginning of the drug war, around 1970. And this is heroin price and purity. This is a heroin price and purity chart. On the left-hand side, we got price per dose, and it's adjusted according to inflation. On the right-hand side, we have purity. So, 1970, a dose was about $6.37. Purity was about 1.5%. As we come forward to 1980, purity is 3.6%. It's going up. And the dose cost is going down. It's now $3.90. And as we jump forward in time to 1999, we're now under $1 at 80 cents a dose, 38% pure. Care to guess how pure heroin is today in, like, Philadelphia? Anyone want to take a guess? 95? We're getting there. About 80. 80%. And it could be laced with fentanyl and who knows what else. It's a clear indication that there are more drugs coming into the country. The potency has increased, and that is not a good picture for our young people. Policies don't work. Drug seizures themselves, I mean, back in 1970, even when I was working undercover, if I seize an ounce of cocaine, good job, get that pat on the back. Quarter ounce of heroin, same thing. Pounds of marijuana, it was a good seizure back then. You know, you would get even a newspaper article. You might even get on TV for making a seizure like that. But today, in comparison, today, to get the same attention, the media attention, you're talking 10 tons of heroin seized at one time, 20 tons of cocaine, and metric tons of marijuana. Depends on what state you're in, though, I guess. And doing surveys by the federal government, school children continue to report that it's easier to buy alcohol than some drugs. And that's because alcohol is regulated. It's not impossible, obviously, but it's more difficult. It takes a little bit more time. You can buy drugs, illicit drugs, just about anywhere. And today, with technology such as, well, smartphones and send a text, you'll have it delivered to you. So, you know, won't our kids, if we legalize, won't they use more? Well, in the Netherlands, and I'm sure most of you know about the Netherlands and their lax policies on marijuana, marijuana use by their 10th graders is at 28%. It's the lowest of all the European nations. A lot lower than here in the United States. And actually, that might be higher than that now, but it's still a lot lower. What else? What about Portugal again? Portugal keeps popping up. And why do they keep popping up? Look at this. 13 to 15-year-olds, since they changed their policies in Portugal 12 years ago, 25% reduction in all drug use. Overall drug use, not just one particular drug, overall drug use. 16 to 19-year-olds, 22% reduction. Mass incarceration. We hear about this all the time. These are about U.S. cumulative arrests from 1970 to about 2006. Drug offenses, literally in the millions. Of course, we're now up above, we're probably up around 45 million, I think, today. So what does that really mean? Let's take a look at a couple of things. Our European nations, when you look at their incarceration rates, they're about, well, I think they're a little lower now. I think they're about maybe 147 per 100,000 in our European nations, like the UK. And in 2008, we had gotten all the way up to 1,009. That was probably our high, no pun intended. 1,009. I think we're down maybe about, oh, here we go, 707 now. We've made some reforms. We didn't make these criminal justice reforms for our incarcerated folks because we were feeling bad. It's financially driven. And I think that's a shame. But I'll take it if we're making progress. But when you look at our prison population compared to other countries, I mean, Russia is number 2, and they're at 474. And the next one is 266 of the Ukraine. We're still outpacing it. We have a long way to go. And we're going to have to really change our drug policies. So how do drugs play into this? So here are marijuana arrests and total drug arrests in the United States. At the bottom, 1970, going up to 2005. We had 500,000 total drug arrests in 1970. Actually, 415,000. But they quadrupled by 2005 to 1.9 million total drug arrests. Of that 1.9 million total drug arrests, 42% were for marijuana alone. Almost half. And of that 42%, 89 were for just possession of marijuana. A couple years ago, we were arresting about 700,000 people in this country a year for marijuana. But because of the reforms, because of what you're doing here in Colorado and some other states, that's now down probably to around 600,000 every year. So what we're doing is making a difference. And this here is the percentage increase of federal prisoners from 1970 to 2005. And this is very interesting. So the yellow, so I think this works. Can you see that little red dot? Okay, so that's 1970. We go all the way up to 2004. In 1970, it's barely even showing. Both red, which are drug offenses, and yellow, which are non-drug offenders. So for non-drug offenders going up, this yellow here, you can see it goes up slightly to 2004-05. Now, these increases, so we started out with 17,302 folks. And at the end of 2004, we had a 294% increase in non-drug offenders. I mean, we have to admit, we like arresting people in this country. We like sending people to prison. That's another story. But look at the drug increase, the drug-related increase, where we had 3,384 folks in the federal, been arrested for the federal system. A 2,558% increase over that time. That's a clear indicator of where law enforcement's attention went. And in doing so, we left violent crime behind. And that's why our solvability rates for violent crime decreased the way that they did, because we were focused on drug offenders. Now, as I get closer to as I begin to wrap this up, let's talk about some diversity issues as to who uses and sells the drugs. Okay, whites constitute 72% of all drug users in the U.S. Blacks are about 13.5% of all drug users in the U.S. Who gets arrested? 37% of those arrested for drug violations are black. Who goes to prison? 60% of those in state prisons for drug felonies are black. And remember, blacks are roughly 13.5% of the population of the country. What about who goes to prison? 81% of our federal drug offenders are black. 81%. The blacks are now serving an average of 6 years, while whites are serving an average of 4 years for the same drug-related crimes. And these are just some graphs that kind of show that in a different way. So this bottom line here, which is the blue line, are whites, and this is around 1980 here, this is 2010 here. You can see there's a slight increase in incarceration rates. This middle line here are Hispanics, and then the top line here are blacks. So you can see the sharp increase. So another way to look at it here are some different crimes from 1980 to 2010. And you've got murder, sexual assault, robbery, assault, burglary. And when you get to 2000, it kind of starts to level off for all of these other crimes here. But by then, this orange line here, this is for drug offenders. Again, where is law enforcement focused? We're focused on drugs. And I'm a firm believer that a big part of that has to do with incentivized policing, federal funding, civil asset forfeiture. Marijuana itself is the biggest cash getter for cops. There was a recent study done by the NAACP. 1 in 57, that's the number of white children with a parent in prison, 1 or 2 parents in prison. And for black children, that number is 1 in 9. 1 in 9. So I'll end with this quote from August Vollmer. August Vollmer is what many of us in law enforcement consider one of the founding fathers of policing here in the United States. He was the chief of police at Berkeley in California. He eventually became the head of the International Association of Chiefs of Police, a very powerful organization of law enforcement leaders in this country. And this is what he says about this situation of drug addiction and drug users and law enforcement and policing. He says stringent laws, vigorous prosecution, and imprisonment of addicts and peddlers have proved not only useless and enormously expensive as means of correcting this evil, but they are also unjustifiably and unbelievably cruel in their application to the unfortunate drug victims. Repression has driven this vice underground and produced the narcotic smugglers and supply agents who have grown wealthy out of this evil practice and who, by devious methods, have stimulated traffic in drugs. Finally, and not the least of these evils associated with repression, the helpless addict has been forced to resort to crime in order to get money for the drug which is absolutely indispensable for his comfortable existence. August Vollmer was back in the 1920s with alcohol prohibition. So he's dealing with this alcohol prohibition issue and now speaking about the direction we were moving in as a country as it relates to the Harrison Narcotics Act and so on. He saw it coming, but we didn't listen. We didn't listen. Again, this is about policy. So let's talk about policy. It's not about the drugs. It's about the policy of prohibition that doesn't work. It never will work, and it's actually counterproductive to public safety. And it's counterproductive to reducing addiction. It's counterproductive to overdose deaths. It's counterproductive to anything that you can think of as a goal under the so-called umbrella of the war on drugs. So let's talk policy. Thanks. Do some Q&A?
Yeah. For the purposes of the recording, you would just project your voice or...
Want to use this?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. Oh, it can be the microphone
You can,
deliverer.
the mic lady.
Who would like to go first?
Thank you, Neill. One of the things that you commented on was, sort of being prepared when you are, confronted by police. Can you give the audience a bit of sort of knowledge about what are things that we should say and how should we react to protect ourselves? Because I think a lot of us don't know how or what to say when we are confronted by police.
Okay, great question. And before I give you some advice, I'm going to refer you to a website called flexyourrights.org. Yeah, give them some love. Steve and Scott, Steve Silverman, he's the director of the organization, and they have a great video on there called 10 Rules for Dealing with the Police. And it teaches you what to say during different scenarios, whether you're encountered, you have an on a street encounter, walking, whether you're driving a car, whether they come knocking on your door, what to say, how to say it to protect your constitutional rights. So, real quick, if you're driving a car, as most people do, and I think this is probably more popular when it comes to police encounters, and you get stopped for a so-called traffic violation or whatever, and the police come up, and remember, like I said, one of the things that they're thinking is how I'm going to search your car. So that's there. And they're going to ask you questions, but what you need to remember is that if they stop you for a traffic violation, that should be a very brief encounter, 5 minutes or so, however long it takes them to write a ticket for that particular violation. And there's going to come a point in time where you need to ask some questions. First of all, when they come up to your car, they should give you their name. This is how they're trained. They're trained to identify themselves, and they're trained to tell you why you were stopped. And it's your right to ask that. And then they'll let you know, or if they don't let you know, whether they're going to write you a ticket or not, you need to ask the question. Am I being cited? Am I not being cited? If they say, no, you're not going to be cited, then you need to ask, well, am I free to go? If you're going to be cited, then once they cite you, and they should take care of that immediately, they'll come back up to the car with the citation for you to sign it. And then, once you sign that citation, am I free to go? And if they continue to talk and ask you questions, well, where are you headed? Where'd you come from? Excuse me, officer, I'm not trying to be rude or anything, but I really need to go. Am I free to go, or are you detaining me? Now, if they have probable cause or if they have reasonable suspicion to detain you, to further an investigation, and they're going to tell you. If they get to the point where they ask to search, and a lot of times they'll say, we got this war on terror thing. Got any bombs? Do you have any weapons of mass destruction? Do you mind if I search? They're not looking for bombs, people. They're looking for drugs. Your constitutional right, the Fourth Amendment, is to be free from unreasonable searches. So, excuse me, officer, I'm not trying to be rude or anything, but I don't consent to searches. Am I free to go, or are you detaining me? They're going to have to tell you yes or no. And you may even get to a point where if they're not answering yes or no, then, well, if I don't have a yes that you're detaining me, then I'm assuming that I'm free to go. Have a nice day, officer, and I'll see you later. And if you start to pull off, if they have reasonable suspicion or probable cause to detain you, they'll let you know. If they need probable cause to search you or your car, and if they have it, they're not going to ask to search. They're going to get you out of the car and they're going to search. But you should always protect your rights. If they come knocking on your home, on your door at your home, a lot of people think you have to answer the door. First of all, if you decide you don't want to answer the door, don't answer the door. If you're watching a great movie, watch your movie. I mean, hopefully they're not coming to tell you that there's been, a tragedy or something. I mean, that's always a possibility. And if you want to find that out, there's nothing wrong with talking through the door. Yes, can I help you? It's the police. Yes, can I help you? Open the door, please. I can hear you. Can I help you? If you have an intercom system, that's even better. I mean, but what I'm saying is, and if you do open the door, a lot of times you might have a chain on the door, you might have something else on the door. That is a clear indicator to the police officer, no, I'm not opening my door all the way. So don't help to push it open. But think about it. Just think about opening the door. You don't have to open the door. And then it's always your right to say, if you do decide to open the door a little bit and they tell you why they're there or whatever, say, okay, well, whatever, I got to go. I'm not trying to be rude or anything, but I really need to go. So thanks for stopping by. Thanks for the information, whatever. Again, if they have probable cause to search your home, they're going to come in and search your home. Again, just protect your rights. Watch the video on flexyourrights.org and get some good information from them. They have a lot of good information on it. And they also have a lot of good information on that on the flexyourrights.org website about the use of video, your cell phone, any other devices that you may have, which is good. Oh.
On the situation with Colorado having recreationalized and a lot of black market money coming here. I've heard the term oil money, and just like people from the East Coast showing up and sending lots of product back home, and like just that whole phenomenon of it being legal in one state but illegal in surrounding states, and
okay.
what that looks like on a police standpoint. Do they keep all the money that they confiscate? And
yeah, so with you here in Colorado being the first state to have really a working, robust recreational market, Washington's coming up behind you. Then we're going to have Oregon eventually once they get their policies in line, and then Alaska. But you're like right smack in the middle of the country. You've got this market open. Yes, you're going to have this when you are the island, and that's why it's so important for other states to come online as quickly as possible. What you're talking about here is diversion. That's why you have law enforcement setting up at the state line, in Nebraska and other states, monitoring traffic. These law enforcement folks need to be in communities dealing with violent crime, not being concerned about somebody moving some pot down the highway. And again, that's what I was trying to say about the focus of law enforcement, civil asset forfeiture. So yes, they realize if they find you coming from Colorado with pot, they're going to take your car, they're going to take any cash you have. Pretty soon, they're probably going to be working the other side of the highway trying to catch the cash going in to the state. That's what we do. You're going to have it until other states come online. And it's going to be very difficult to deal with until that happens. When we ended alcohol prohibition in 1933, we did it the same way as you're seeing here now. And just so people know, alcohol prohibition wasn't really prohibition. It was decriminalization. Because the 18th Amendment said it was only illegal to manufacture, transport, and to sell alcohol. It was okay to use. You could use it. And that's why I'm not really a big advocate of decriminalization policies in this country, because unfortunately our political landscape, our political leaders, they're of the mindset that if they pass a policy of decriminalization for marijuana, then they're not going to come back to the issue of marijuana for another couple of years. I'd rather, from day one, focus on ending the prohibition of cannabis and spend all the time and energy and resources we have on just flat out ending prohibition, like you've done here in this state. So civil asset forfeiture is going to be huge until we do this, but state by state in 1933, we just stopped enforcing alcohol policies. And the feds eventually came around and it just ended it. And we're going to see this, we're seeing the same thing now. Yes. She's got, here we go.
Hi. I really admire your work, and I've been paying attention for the past 5 or 6 years. I'm from back east, but I moved to Colorado in order to be able to do some work within the field. My stepdad was a cop, so that's a bit of a background. Do you believe that the police departments feel as though that they're funding their own departments in making these arrests? And how do we stop the fear that they have?
Okay, so this is something that I'm trying to communicate across the country, because sometimes I hear people saying, well, obviously the police don't want this to happen because they're going to lose jobs. You know, the corrections, they don't want it to happen because they're going to lose jobs as we start emptying the prisons and stop sending people into prisons. But that's not true. And here's why. Number one, dealing with the money, to answer your question, yes, the federal funds do supplement law enforcement budgets. When I was working with the Baltimore Police Department, my last year there, I was the head of human resources, so I had the budget under my command. And I had 3 or 4 people in a special unit, and all they did was go find me grant money. You know, cops grants, federal dollars, state dollars, dealing with drug enforcement, and so on. And I used that money to supplement other things. Civil asset forfeiture, again, in our police departments, we have units that, state police, for instance, they have a unit that deals strictly with civil asset forfeiture. How to manage that money, where does it go, how does it come in, and do all that stuff. So yes, we've gotten to a place now where we depend on that money. One of the things that I suggest, and the same thing with federal grant dollars, like I said, but one of the things I suggest, we don't have to cut off the federal grant dollars, just give it to police departments for violent crime. See, the second thing that we get federal dollars for, number 2 in order, is the Violence Against Women Act, which is a good reason for getting federal dollars. Let's focus on that. Let's deal with that. Let's deal with human trafficking, because when you're talking about human trafficking, you're talking about women, you know, for the most part, and children. Let's direct money to that. Let's direct money to investigating domestic violence. Let's direct money to analyzing all the tens of thousands of rape kits that we have sitting on shelves. You know, we have DNA now. Let's analyze all that DNA and go find out who's committing these rapes. So let's just redivert the money. As it relates to losing jobs, the rate of change is slow enough that attrition would handle that. See, in law enforcement today, we have programs to incentivize senior police officers from retiring. We don't want them to retire because we need that person. At the other end, we're having academy class after academy class, and we're fighting each other, departments, for the best candidates. We even steal newly graduating police officers from one department and steal them for other departments. So, what will happen is we'll be able to allow people to retire. Instead of having 2 academy classes this year, we only need 1. But no one's going to lose a job. If you currently have a full-time job, no one's going to lose a job. Now, you might lose a little bit more overtime, but you're not going to lose your job. Same thing with corrections. It'd be the same thing. Normal attrition would handle that. And so that's a fallacy. And if you ever hear anybody saying that, no one's going to lose a job. Okay? And as far as the policing industry, I guarantee you, if we didn't have these policies of prohibition, when we eventually get to that place, maybe it's 2 or 3 decades down the road, we can cut our police departments in half Now, I'm talking 25, 30 years down the road. But Baltimore, that has 3,200 sworn members for a population of about 620 to 630,000 citizens, we would only need a little over 1,000, and they would focus on violent crime. But no one would lose a job. Yes. We'll come back to you.
And I don't know if maybe you explained this while I was out, but what happens to the money with the civil asset forfeiture? What's supposed to happen to it, and what actually happens to it? I don't know.
That's a good question. So let me first explain the two different systems of civil asset forfeiture. You have one that's under the federal umbrella. It's called the asset sharing program. So as a local police department, I can seize cash or property, then process it through the feds. Now, the federal government, Eric Holder, has made some changes to that program. Not enough, but he has begun to make some changes to that program, restricting some of that interaction. But the way it works is, it's a simpler process for me to see if I seize $1,000, I then file it through the federal program. They keep 20%. I get 80 back. They write me a check for $800. You
personally or
the department? Okay. Now, depending upon the state and the individual state policies for seized assets, for most states, that money goes right back into law enforcement, that unit or that department, for furthering their drug investigations, per se. There are some jurisdictions where the money might go into a general fund, and you're going to see less seizures in that jurisdiction. Because in the jurisdictions where it comes back to the department, they can use it, and I mean, some of you may know, it could be anything from buying a car, to buying militarized equipment, to buying surveillance equipment, to buying a margarita machine. There's not a lot of policy or regulation or law governing that, so it's really up to the integrity of the police officers, and in many cases the prosecutor's office. The other program are individual state programs. There's currently a lot of reform underway. I think the New Mexico has just passed some recent legislation that has pretty much ended it. You know, now, because, and let me just explain that for the most part, current policy means that I could seize cash from you and not charge you with a crime. And that's the bulk of the problem. What we're basically asking, generally, is that if we're going to seize cash, if police are going to seize cash or property, they have to charge you with a crime. And if you're not convicted, you get it back. If you are convicted, that's another story, and then that becomes evidence of the crime in your conviction. And sometimes some of that would be plea bargain to go a certain way. But there's a lot of attention now to unravel these civil asset forfeiture policies. So lobby your elected officials, let them know that you want that to end state by state. This young lady over here had a question.
Thank you, Neill. I know that I'm sure crime statistics and just criminal behavior is kind of a complex issue, but I was wondering if there's any policy or anyone that's working on sort of projections for what, say, with marijuana, the ending of marijuana prohibition, if there's any projections on what, you know, sensible drug policy would look like in terms of criminal statistics.
I haven't really seen anything concrete, and you probably won't until those people who typically do that type of research are to a point where they believe, okay, this is going to happen with cannabis, across the country. So what's that going to look like? And what's the projected time frame? I don't think there's been yet enough movement where they can project a time frame. Is it going to be 2020? Is it going to be 2022, 24? And then how will that play out? What does that mean in terms of arrests, fewer arrests? What does that mean as relates to gross, proceeds, tax dollars, which states first, how is this going to spread across the country? I think someone will eventually get there and someone will try to project that out. I don't think we're there yet. But from just looking at the snapshot here, and I don't know if there's anyone in the audience that can comment on how many jurisdictions or counties or towns here in this state have actually, okay, recreational. We have a program up and running. Because I understand that not every jurisdiction is on board yet. About what percentage in the state, what percentage of the state is, for instance, on board or has recreational policies and dispensaries open and that sort of thing? Does anyone know? Do you think, is it most?
No, I think it's about 50%.
Yeah, because
it's town by town. So you got to
yeah,
go in and
because when I went to the I think it was January when I came out here to the Association of Chiefs put on that conference for law enforcement from around the country. I got the impression that they weren't anywhere near the entire state being open for business per se, because there were some law enforcement folks there from the state whose towns weren't yet on board. So that's why I was asking.
it comes up for review.
Right. So there's still a lot to be done in this state, and but the data that we've been seeing reported, the reduced number of arrests and what that means, what that translates to. I mean, I think we can figure out hard dollars and hard costs. But here's something that's very interesting. We have no idea what the indirect costs are or the indirect benefits per se are. I mean, when you look at Prohibition, yeah, I can give you hard costs. I can give you the $50 billion that we're spending every year in cops' courtrooms and prisons and that sort of thing. But what are the indirect costs? What does that equate to? When someone's in prison and they're not out here working, in the cannabis industry maybe, and not paying taxes. And it's not just about them working and paying taxes. They're not shopping at local stores. What happens if you have another million people paying taxes, shopping at stores, buying gas, buying cars, buying goods? That means they're putting other people to work because you're boosting the economy. And then other things happen. We have no idea what the indirect cost of this drug war really is. It's mind-boggling if you really sit down and think about it. It's got to be. It's got to be. So on the flip side of that, what would the benefits be? Not just in hard costs, but in indirect costs once we end these policies. I think you'll see a completely different country on so many different levels. So many different levels.
Okay, let's do, how about we ask the last 3 questions all together, and then you can answer, and then we can wrap it up. So let's do, I'm going to go to you, and then Abby, and then Tyler.
So I do have, sorry about that. So I do have one quick question, and it kind of comes down to more of once legalization becomes a federal matter, and how would you address the issue of people who are already in prison for the crime, re-releasing them, and then also helping them to become part of the general public again? Because some of these kids are taking 10, 15 years out of their lives. Now all their connections they know aren't the best of characters. They don't know really anyone back in the outside. How would that be addressed from like a social and psychological standpoint, maybe?
It's a great question. More of the hidden costs, too, the effects on the family members.
You spoke earlier about how personally you feel that a nationwide legalization process for cannabis would be the best policy for us. I'm curious what your stance on other substances such as heroin and cocaine would be. Would you say that nationwide legalization would be the best route for those substances, or would you focus more on harm reduction or decriminalization for those?
Another great question.
Tyler.
That was actually almost my question exactly, with the decriminalization and legalization, some of the differences, and whether or not you think that that viewpoint, it seemed kind of to me that you weren't a fan of decriminalization, and I know that there have been some studies to show that helpful, especially in a prohibition policy. Is that a common viewpoint, or is that kind of radical?
Okay. All right. So with the release of prisoners now, first of all, I don't think we have to wait until the feds get here. Most of the folks we got locked up are at the state level. All right, so when states are changing their policies, such as here, one of the things, and I think where we need your help, is to lobby those legislators to put in legislation that if you're in prison for marijuana possession, selling, cultivation, I'm not talking about violence or anything like that. And this is my opinion. This is not LEAP's opinion. LEAP has no position on this, so I need to, that disclaimer, it's important. Number one, lobby your policymakers to put it in the legislation, that these folks need to come out. Now, once we start bringing them out, what happens? How do we prepare them for re-entering society? So much to look at. Obviously they're going to need to work. We may have some educational issues. We may have some mental health issues. There are a lot of things that we are not properly dealing with regarding our prison population. So each person will have to be, there has to be an assessment as to what their needs are. And what about their family? Who's waiting for them on the outside? What are the challenges they might be having? So any barriers that may exist need to be obviously broken down. We're still going to have the stigma thing to deal with, because that's a mindset. So education is going to have to continue regarding stigma. We're going to have to maybe buy everybody a Carl Hart book, high price, so that they see things from a different perspective. And again, that's only going to happen if the people require it, demand it, in getting your policymakers to do the right thing. You see, because as all this money is being made in the state now, as the taxes are rolling in, if we don't tell our elected officials what to do with that money and demand that they do certain things, it's going to be lost. And hopefully that can be written into legislation. Because at the end of the day, there have been a number of communities that have been devastated by these policies of prohibition, and I think we are responsible. We have a responsibility. I mean, think about this. What do we do as a country when we end a war? When we've gone into a country and have, destroyed it, we rebuild it. We pour in billions of dollars. We send people in to help rebuild, to train, to educate. Why can't we do that in our own communities? This literally was a war, is a war. So that's what we need to do. I hope that answered your question. Okay. The second question about other drugs. Again, my opinion, a disclaimer, not LEAP's. All right, so looking at heroin, and I think we can learn from what other countries are doing. We can look at Portugal. But I like what I see in Switzerland with safe injection facilities. And not only are there safe injection facilities where an addict can go, someone who's addicted, and administer their dosage with a clean syringe under medical supervision, they supply a controlled grade of heroin. So you know how pure it is. You know that it's not laced with anything else. Again, you're under medical supervision. They have 0 overdose deaths. You know, and the good thing about this type of program is that the people who are using it, their life changes. You see, because if you speak to someone who's addicted to heroin, the real challenge for the most part, yeah, they have the addiction, but how do I finance my addiction? You know, in many cases, I'm not working, can't work, can't get a job, stigmatized, might have an arrest record. So the chaos in my life is about finding the money for my next dose. Okay, I might have to sell my body, I might have to commit robberies, I might have to burglarize, I might have to steal from my family and friends. Whatever I got to do, I'm going to do it to get it. But in this scenario, that chaos goes away. So crime has dropped among this population of folks who are part of this program. The police love it. They're actually part of the program and work with the program. People can go live with family again because they can be trusted again. And that is key to someone getting out of an addiction. If you isolate them the way that we do, prison, stigma, whatever, they have a very little chance of ever beating that addiction. But when you embrace them and give them a loving environment, their chances go up dramatically, and that's what they experience. So that's an example. And I think if we do that, see, most of the heroin, for instance, is used by the addicted population. So if we cater to that addicted population with such programs, it shrinks the illicit market. And I think that's a great place to begin. Cocaine might be a little different. First of all, I know that meth has come on, the illicit meth market has come on board because cocaine is illegal. We used to refer to meth when it first came on the scene as a poor man's cocaine. It's a stimulant. But I think if we find a way to regulate cocaine, maybe it's a pharmaceutical model for adults, where you can go and get a little bit or whatever, or a certain amount. By far, most of the people who use cocaine, they use it recreationally. Again, the media and what we hear and what's delivered to us, through our ears and our eyes, is this very small, narrow focus of people who have problems with these drugs. Overall, most people who use these drugs use them responsibly. And that would even improve if it were a regulated market where you have quality control measures and you have a better product being produced. So I think that's where, it's kind of like where we can begin. I don't know what lies beyond that, but I think that's a good place to begin. And then we'll figure out what comes next and what comes next. At the end of the day, the key is a health-centered approach. Let's stop locking people up first who are addicted to these drugs. Do what we can to shrink the illicit market, you know, which will get rid of the tainted products that are out there, the problematic products, well, that's a tongue twister, that are out there, and just keep moving down the road. Just keep moving down the road and see where we end up. So I hope that answers your question. Was there a little bit more to that? Was there a little bit more to that question? I think I handled it, right? Okay. But one thing I want to say to everybody is, again, our organization, Law Enforcement Against Prohibition, we have this wonderful speakers bureau. We have Carrie over here and Lenny. I know Jay was here earlier, wasn't he? Is he still here? Okay. Two of our great speakers, they're available. Find a way to get them into your communities to speak. You know, you don't have to try to explain this. We're the only law enforcement organization around the globe who does this work. And believe me, we're very convincing, you know, when we get in front of people. Use our website. Use the videos that are on our website and just show a quick video to somebody. There's a great one on there by Peter Christ, who was one of the founding members of LEAP. In 14 minutes, he just knocks it right out from a logical, fact-based perspective. And that's what we do. We understand the fear. We understand the emotion. But that's not what this is about. This is about what works for policy. You can't legislate morality. You shouldn't ever try to legislate morality. And that's what has happened. So use our organization, use our speakers, go onto our website. Everybody in here has probably got a smartphone. You can do it right now and go to our website, make sure we have your email address, or you can sign up on a sign-up sheet outside. but we're here for you. We're here to help you out in changing these policies around the globe. So again, thank you for being here. Love you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everybody. If you didn't have a chance, I'm not sure if you're even there, but we made some evaluation forms. There's some on the table we would love. We're trying to capture some information about who's here and the benefits of this symposium, or what you wish to see next time, or any other ideas you have. Maybe they're on the front table. If you see them, grab them. We'd love for you to fill one out. Thank you, Lindsay, for helping to organize. Lindsay Aiken, who's the Speakers Bureau Coordinator for LEAP, and everyone else who participated, etc. We have grand plans to go to the Taj after and continuing a conversation. I don't know, is anyone interested in that? So anyone who's interested can go, we have the party room reserved in the Taj right across the way at 8 o'clock if you would like to go there. Yeah.
Good, how are you? Yeah, he's going so much about you. I just come